Well, we're back from our much-needed break there. Next on our agenda is Law and Licensing Committee report. We'll have Chair Hansen.
Thank you, Chair Huntsman. Yes, it is a little difficult to remember 3 weeks out, especially when we're already looking at tomorrow's business. So I hope you'll be patient with me here. Okay, this is the Law and Licensing Committee meeting of October 13th. We approved the meeting minutes, and then we looked at R277621, District of Residence. It's a new rule. We actually made some changes to this rule in August 2017. We added some language to it, and then so we made a revision one. So we voted unanimously to approve R277621 revision 1 on first reading, and we move that the board approve R277621 revision 1 as amended on second and final reading.
Okay, the motion to the board is that the Law and Licensing Committee moves that the board approve R277-621 revision 1 as amended on second and final reading. Any discussion? Seeing none, let's, oh, there it is. Got it. Thank you.
I just have a question
Board
on
Member Cannon.
the motion from the committee. So it says approve on second and final reading. Does that mean that it goes to the third reading calendar and shows up, or it means this is an immediate action? Both readings are happening now.
We'll have Angie speak to that.
Thank you, Deputy Superintendent Angie Stallings. With the change in how the board schedule is structured now, where you have committee meetings 1 month and then a month later you have the board meeting, in the past, and board members who have been here a long time can correct me if I'm wrong, we did a first and second reading in 1 month, and then we put it on consent calendar so that you'd have a month in time to receive additional comment and potentially get recommended changes from the public, et cetera. And then you would pass it on third reading. So you'd essentially have 2 board meeting periods where that rule was talked about, considered, and then passed. Because of the change, if you do a first and a second and final, and we've done that actually in the past, we've done it all in 1 month at times, where you do the first and second and final in 1 month, and then we've filed it. So our board policy already allows for it. The board has done this in the past where you actually only take 1 month to take the action. And this is a policy call for the board, and maybe it hasn't been raised explicitly. I know I've talked about it to some board members. If we do a first reading 1 month, a second reading the next month, and then a third reading the other, you will be reviewing rules for 3 board meetings, essentially almost 3 months, which really elongates the time for us to file things with the Office of Administrative Rules. If you would like to do that, we're happy to do that as a matter of course. Because I felt like the history or the reason for that consent calendar reading and having that month was to allow a month period for additional feedback, you have that with the first reading in 1 month, the second reading in the other. And as you'll notice today, there's quite a few revisions that you're going to see in certain rules based on that month time period. So as staff, we would recommend, especially at this time of year, where the rules are legally, you are supposed to have them filed by November with the Office of Administrative Rules under statutory requirements. And maybe even always to just do a first and second and final reading so that you still maintain the 2 months worth of time as opposed to extending it to a third board meeting. So I hope that helps. We as staff have included in our motions to just do a first, second, and final, and have assumed that we would no longer use that third reading consent requirement. But if you would like to direct us otherwise, all you'd need to do is then say second reading and with the expectation that there'd be a third reading next month. It'd be put on consent.
Vice Chair Ellis.
I think that we, as a board, need to think about this on some topic. I mean, I could see that there's some that it would be fine to pass it out, but it has only been, this particular rule has only been in committee for a first reading and now in front of the board for one reading. And so I think that's what Board Member Cannon's referring to. So when you say it's been in front of the board twice, it's only been in front of a committee and the board once. So I think that in a lot of instances, I would like to see it go to a third reading, but I think we as board members could amend each motion individually to do that.
Okay. Board Member Hanson?
I'm just giving the report.
What's that? Oh, okay. Board Member Lear?
My concern, I had two concerns about this. First of all, it was sort of unsettling to hear about it for the first time when I knew that the practice had been very different for 25 years, to hear about it in a meeting that wasn't even a board meeting. So that's just a little bit of an aside, but it would be nice if the board could at least hear about or discuss these changes that seem very, I know they seem probably pretty technical and pretty acceptable and logical to a lot of staff members who haven't been here so long, but I think it was a board practice for a long time, and that I think so that's unsettling. That's one part. Second part is, for my purposes, I don't care how long it takes to pass a rule. I think if and frankly, without being too harsh, the staff's emergency is not my problem. We shouldn't never have skipped a couple of meetings that we did in the spring, and that's, I think, what made put us into problems about getting things passed in a timely way. But I want to have enough discussion about these rules, and I feel like 2 meetings of discussion and one on the consent calendar, where typically they're not discussed again, is not excessive. And again, if I have to choose between messiness and transparency, I will choose that over efficiency. I really want some of these rules we're discussing are very significant major changes. And I think we need 2 meetings of discussion in order to understand those and have our stakeholders participate and understand them. And I know, and I hear what you said, and I don't need it, I hear what you said about we can do, and I'm sorry, Chair, can I have a little bit of an addition to my comment that I just realized I missed?
I don't want to say no to you, but we want to stay, if we're going to comment on something, let's be prepared to comment and then end because we've got other lights on. But yes, you may.
It'll take
we'll
one sentence.
Okay.
I hear what you're saying about the board can go either way. I understand that now the policy or rule or whatever it is allows for it, but I still think it is important to have a process, as I said earlier in the day, that is consistent and predictable for our stakeholders' sake.
And
Just one comment, there are 2 comments actually. Number one, what we could do in the future to help alleviate this is maybe ask the committees to make that determination when they make their motion, whether they're going to recommend that it be on second and final or whether it be on second and third. And that could give the committee an opportunity to discuss this process and how it impacts each individual rule. And I apologize if I didn't make that clear. And in some ways, I think as staff, we were kind of it wasn't something we anticipated with the change in the schedule. And so I apologize. It was never something that was noticed on an agenda for me to talk about this. And so I actually welcome this discussion. I think it's really important. The second thing is this particular rule, this 125, actually was on law and licensing agenda 3 times over 3 months. So this is actually the 4th month it's on a schedule. And so I just wanted to mention, you said, well, if staff had brought it sooner, we actually did bring it sooner. It's that sometimes the feedback, I think that this 125 has actually been reviewed.
621.
Or 621. Sorry, it's HB 125. R277-621. In this particular instance, that may be a reason why you would want to do it on second and final, because it did have 3 committee hearings. And there may be individual circumstances, which later we can talk about, for example, R277-920, and it's got some funding requirements where we as staff have to start distributing money in January if you don't have a rule in place. You actually give more authority to your staff, meaning you would the staff would have to start doing things without a rule being in place. So those are some considerations, and I totally agree. We should start looking at this on a rule-by-rule basis, and then allowing the board to make those determinations, and I'll be happy to facilitate that.
Chair Hansen?
That's what I was just going to say as well. I think we can look at it on a rule-by-rule basis in committee, and if it comes, and then we can say what the committee motion is to the board from the rule, depending on what we decided on our committees.
Okay. The motion before the board is that the board approve R277-621 Revision 1 as amended on second and final reading. Any further discussion? Seeing none, let's vote. All in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed? Okay, voting was unanimous.
Okay, then we looked at R277-211, and we discussed it. We asked the Attorney General's office, the AG's office, to come back and give us some input, and we'll be talking about that tomorrow. Then we had some school nurse health updates, and they are planning to bring forward a draft board rule in the next month or two to law and licensing, so there was no action there. Then R277-491, school community councils. There was a couple of small changes to this rule that the school community the PTA parents at the PTA convention raised a concern. So they took it to TAC, and TAC discussed the issue and brought this rule forward to us. So we voted unanimously to approve R277-491 as amended and continued on first reading, and ask that the board approve R277-491 as amended and continued on second and final reading.
For clarity on there, I have R277-491-4.
Those -4s shouldn't be in there, so
You don't want that in,
they should or they shouldn't.
they should
should
be in
be.
there, shouldn't they?
Did the board
Angie, will you
approve?
speak to that, please?
Okay.
Thank you. Sometimes we only file one section with the Office of Administrative Rules where we don't file the whole rule. Only this section of the rule was actually presented to law and licensing, and it was such a small change. So it really is just the section of that rule that's going to be filed or changed.
Okay, thank you. So law and licensing moves that the board approve R277-491-4 as amended and continued on second and final reading.
Okay, the motion before the board is that we approve R277-491-4 as amended and continued on second reading and final reading. Any discussion? Seeing none, let's vote. All in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed? Voting is unanimous.
Okay, then R277-469, Instructional Materials Commission Operating Procedures. We had some questions about how to use the book depository, and we've been talking about this in our committee for several months. And you heard the public comment this morning on it as well. We made some motions to amend some items in R277-469. You can see Carol's motions there. And then we moved to pass R277-469 as amended and continued on first reading. And the Law and Licensing Committee moves that the board approve R277-469 as amended and continued on second and final reading.
The motion before the board is that the board approve R27-469 as amended and continued on second and final reading. Any discussion?
I have a clarification question. Is it this revision 1 or revision 2 or?
Okay. Board member
Angie?
Cannon, what I have.
Which one are you bringing to us, or just the?
It's revision 2. It just doesn't say it here. It doesn't say any revisions at all here.
It's revision 2.
Okay. Law and Licensing Committee moves that the board approve R277-469 revision 2, and that's going to need to be changed on our revision 2 as amended. Thank you,
So it should
Janet.
say revision 2?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Thank you for catching that. Okay, the motion before the board is that the board approve R277-469 revision 2 as amended and continued on second and final reading. Any further discussion? Seeing none, let's vote. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? Voting was unanimous.
Okay,
Please continue.
R277515, Utah Educator Professional Standards. Ben reviewed UPAC's proposed amendments to the Educator Standards to make clarifications and strengthen aspects of the rule. Then we moved to pass Rule R277515 as amended and continued on first reading. The motion passed 3-1 with members Bolter, Ellis, and Hanson in favor, and member Lear opposed. The committee moves that the board approve R277515 as amended and continued on second and final reading.
The motion before the board is that the board approve R277-515 as amended and continued on second and final reading. Any discussion? Board Member Lear.
I have one amendment I'd like to propose. It's now the time, and then can I speak to it? On line 313, 314, this goes largely to a comment that was made this morning. And I think that the speaker's comment, it was very well taken. The amendment I'd like to make is to say understands and follows, if you've got line 313, 314, understands and follows a school or administrative policy or procedure, period. Going back to the way, or it would be a semicolon, going back to the way it was.
Okay, do we have a second
Second.
to the amendment?
And can I speak to that now?
Can you speak to that, please? Yes.
I think that the speaker's comment this morning, Mrs. Hagren, made an excellent point. She said it more articulately than I've heard it expressed, and that is that well, and she said one thing, and then I have a further thought to that too. But I think that her point was that this is blending licensing discipline and employment discipline, and I don't think that's a healthy thing. I think that our intention was always to make licensing discipline separate from employment discipline, and I think we can't have it both ways. If we want to keep those separate, then, and neither can school districts, neither can LEAs. So if they want to keep those separate, then LEAs are responsible for directives of any kind that are not in writing. Licensing goes more to, are you failing to follow written policies and laws that you're supposed to be familiar with? And I think that documented, however, even if they're documented directives, are more ambiguous, and they're person specific and they're district specific, and I don't think they should be licensing action. So I'd like that. My second point is, this is one more example of just, I think, insidiously, but definitely expanding the punishment against teachers without adequate discussion and consideration. So I would like to propose that amendment.
Okay, we have a second. You're going to speak, Board Member Hanson?
So there was a reason why this was done this way, and we talked about it at length in committee. So if we could have Ben and Angie come up and explain that reasoning so that we could
Okay.
have some more detail.
Are you, yeah, the chair invites people up, so I'll invite them up for you.
Thank you.
So you're invited to come up to the table.
If I can just make a couple points, there were a couple reasons that there was one, the primary reason that we suggested this is that we have run into a number of cases where, as part of things that districts are referring to us to investigate, we have situations where teachers are receiving pointed directives from administrators as to do something or not to do something, and in conjunction with other violations, it comes to us that they violated directives from their administrators. We added the documented part there to hopefully show that it would be in writing and hopefully show that there would be proof to establish that that directive had been given. But that's why we established it. It kind of goes along with some of these other complements to these other standards would be how I would describe it. The other thing I would just point out on this is not mandatory discipline in cases of a documented directive. If you look at the rule there, it says it may result in licensing discipline. It kind of is up to the district about whether they think it's serious enough to refer this to us. It says generally they're going to refer it to us if there have been a number of problems so that it comes to a certain level, and then it would be reported to us. So that's our thinking behind proposing this rule. However, it's obviously the board's policy call as to how to handle that.
Okay. Anyone else want to speak? to the amendment. Lorraine, will you please, Board Member Lear?
I just like Ben said, there have been a number of cases. I'd like more specificity. One case, 15, 2, and could you be really, I don't want the names of them, but I'd like you to be very
I'd have, I can
correct.
I can think of anecdotal evidence. One that we have, one case that we have that involved boundary violations where the teacher had been told specifically you're not to have this student as a TA during your prep period. Was given specific directives on that. The teacher violated that, and there were other boundary violations that complemented that, and then the board's taken action. I mean, I couldn't guess as to the number. I think it's something that happens quite frequently, but I don't have a number for you.
But you said several. I just wondered if you could identify, and you've identified one. Thank you.
Before I have you state that, Lorraine, one sec. Vice Chair Brittany Cummins.
So it goes to, the question that I have is, would this be necessary? Because if you're talking about boundary violations, they'd be covered in other parts of this particular rule and wouldn't necessarily need to be covered as a directive, which would be obvious for an administrator to take. And so I guess my question is how would this be different than, because if they're in non-compliance to anything else that's in the rule, then they're in non-compliance with the rule. And this would extend that to other things like, you should cut your hair, et cetera, which isn't a UPAC violation, et cetera. It's an opinion of an administrator. And so I guess that would be my question, is the necessity of extending it to other directives from an administrator.
I think the one thing it would accomplish, if I may, Chair, is that we, in our presumptions, we have certain presumptions set up, and then we have aggravating and mitigating circumstances. One of the aggravating circumstances is the number of standards that have been violated. So it would come into play there if there are multiple standards. That's often something the board looks at. It's a tool the board has. There are many cases that we bring before the board that the board has questions about the UPAC recommendation and wants to take a different action. Sometimes it's higher. If you have aggravating circumstances, that's one tool the board has to do that. Minor things like you talked about, like cutting hair or something like that. No, the board, a district wouldn't report that to UPAC, and UPAC wouldn't authorize me to open an investigation based on that. But when it is something that comes into play often, like I said, where it's complementary to other violations, it would be a tool towards aggravation or towards to consider the seriousness of the educator's conduct and the scope of it.
Okay, a follow-up.
Do we have another rule that talks about aggravating and mitigating circumstances? And would that be more appropriate to have in there as a as an aggravating item?
Please.
So our presumptions rule, which is what sets those, lists aggravating circumstances. And one of the aggravating circumstances that it lists is how many standards of conduct the educator has violated. So they kind of play together. Is why they would play together there, and why it would be appropriate to be considered here.
Board Member Reeby.
Not unless we're going to move the standards there.
So Vice Chair Cummings brings up an interesting point. We talk about local control, and now we're trying to take away that local control by saying, all right, we're going to step in and help you with these problems. I see that it's not supposed to happen that way, but now you are opening up a way to give LEAs a way for us to use something that's an employment issue, turning it to be connected to their license more easily. So I'm concerned that this is not the path that we want to go down. I think that if a district is to the point where they're bringing something to UPAC, then when they investigate this person, these things will come out if it's that egregious. But if we're going to start talking about insubordination or something that's a directive from a supervisor that's not being dealt with locally, then they should deal with that locally, and it shouldn't be attached to their license. And I don't think there's enough. You'd have to tell me that it's an overwhelming amount of people that this is happening to, or districts, that this would make this seem like something that we want to tackle. We are very busy here, and if a district can't deal with those on that case level on themselves, then that's not something we should be tackling. If it's something egregious enough, then it'll already be in the investigation that's happening.
Okay. Is your light, Board Member Belknap?
Yes, thank you. Okay, I feel like I'm in a dark tunnel because I don't know what is happening here. Okay, so what is being changed that isn't, fire alarm, let's go.
Elevator work.
Sorry. So what is being changed in this that hasn't already been done? And tell me exactly what it is that's being changed.
It's simply listing as part of the educator standards that if you have a documented directive from your administrator, you should follow it. It gives the LEAs the discretion to report that. It's not mandatory discipline, and it's also something that if a case is reported on other issues, and that's part of the problem, UCAC can look at that, the board can look at that to determine the seriousness of the problem.
Let me
Okay.
reel this in just a little bit. Lorraine, will you please restate the amendment?
Get to it. Okay, I have that lines 313 through 314 should be changed to read, understands and follows a school or administrative policy or procedure, period.
Actually, semicolon.
Oh, semicolon. Semicolon.
Okay. Board Member Lear, do you have
Something
anything
different?
additional that you want to add?
I do. I don't think this is a simple change. I think this is a broadening of whether districts refer it or not, LEAs refer it or not. I think it's a broadening of the range of licensing action. I think, as Brittany points out, that if these are serious directives, they'll be in a rule, they'll be in a written policy that gives consistency and predictability to educators, seeing as our training is not as good as our punishment. So I would really strongly say, until there is more discussion, if you want to bring back a number of cases where this is stymied UPAC, I'd be willing to listen to that. But until then, I think that this is a broadening based on one situation that can already be dealt with by the employer.
Work during board meetings.
Okay, we have about a 10-minute, we'll have about 10 more minutes of this. So
No, he's got to do one more hole. This should be it.
If it goes through.
Oh,
It takes a while to drill a
Wrong.
hole through metal.
okay,
I can talk loud.
he's still on that same one. We're going to, Vice Chair Brittany Cummins, I think we can people hear over?
Yeah. And I would just
Yes.
like to note that they are very polite. They did not run over me in the parking lot. They let me pass. So the people up there are very nice. So okay. Then I'll speak really quick. I wonder if maybe just adding clarification to documented directive to refer it back to specifically documented directives that have to do with, the word's gone, some type of a misstep in regard to the rule, right? So it circles back. So understanding and follows school or administrative policy or procedure or documented directives in relation to a lapse in, sorry, the words are gone, but do you know what I mean? That we refer it back to, that it's a specific, because you can have a documented directive about a lot of things like classroom management, et cetera, but
Right.
making sure that this is documented directives that would be a mitigating factor for something else that's in a UPAC.
But Vice Chair Brittany Cummins, are you wanting to amend?
What about, I've got an idea.
Okay, well, hang on. Please, thank you. Okay. Will you restate the motion, or the amendment to the motion? And then get ready to add, and we'll see if we can help you get where you need to be.
Okay, the amendment is that on lines 313 and 314 be changed to read, understands and follows a school or administrative policy or procedure, semicolon.
Okay, and you want to amend that to,
To say, or documented directives
Okay,
hang on
that
one
are in reference, like, I don't have a word, sorry.
Okay. Can I do it since it's my motion? I've got,
well, no, it's her amendment to your,
you can.
yeah, we can all.
Oh, no, we can't. We've been told.
Okay, we're trying to keep order here, and we're going to be all over this. Is there,
Yes, I think I've got the words.
you think you have the words?
Yes,
So will you
I have
state
my
the
words.
words and see if Brittany is okay with it?
Procedure or documented directives specific to a rule or policy.
Okay, Thank you. So the amendment to the amendment would read, Lorraine? That's why I'm not.
Okay, so if it was amended, it would read, understands and follows a school or administrative policy or procedure.
No, proceed.
Oh, or, okay, sorry. Follows a school,
Or documented directives specific to a rule or policy.
yeah, she better, yeah, I don't have that.
Can I read it to you?
Okay, yes.
Understands and follows a school or administrative policy, procedure, or documented directive specific to a rule or policy.
Okay, so this is the amendment to the amendment. Now
And
this
it's
is going to
friendly,
get,
I accept it.
and do we have a second to the amendment?
Oh, there's no such thing.
Okay.
But I do
So we're
anyway.
going to vote for the amendment to the amendment. All in favor, oh. Discussion. Okay, sorry. All right, I didn't see your light, so there you go. Board Member Belknap.
I'm kind of confused on my light. Should I turn it on or not on?
On when you want to speak.
Oh, because I thought when others were speaking, you were supposed
Well,
to turn it off.
they stopped.
Okay, I was just trying to get clarity there, boss.
All right.
Okay, sorry. Can I hear what Angie was maybe going to, different words that they were going to use for this amendment before I vote?
So before
Okay.
Carol made her,
Yes,
Member Lear
well-
made her proposal, we were going to suggest documented directive related to another educator standard. I think what Board Member Lear has suggested is fairly similar.
Okay.
So does that satisfy we have this amendment to the amendment. So we're speaking to the amendment to the amendment.
Oh,
Seeing none, let's vote. All in favor, say aye. Aye. Those opposed? Voting was unanimous. So the amendment, so we had amendment to amendment, and this is where it gets crazy. So we have, so the amendment to the amendment is going to, the amendment's going to state what?
Let's see if I got this right. Okay.
Okay, let's all,
Understands and follows a school or administrative policy, procedure, or documented directive specific to a rule or policy. Is that correct?
okay. Anyone want to speak to the amended amendment? Seeing none, let's vote. All in favor, say aye. Aye. Those opposed? Voting was unanimous. So now we're going to go back to hang on. Oh, sorry. Vice Chair Brittany Cummins.
okay, and I apologize for bringing this particular up and not to committee last month, but I had the wonderful opportunity of taking the ethics examination based on this particular rule. And you answer a question and then it references a point of the rule. So it's just kind of coincidence that this rule would be on the agenda today, because I did have a question as I was going through this particular opportunity. And on line 249 to 250, it says, an educator shall take action to protect a student from any known condition detrimental to that student's physical health, mental health, safety, or learning. And as I went through this, it became very vague to me. And it's just like, well, what does that mean? Like when you talk about the mental health of a student, that's a very subjective item. And so as you looked at that, and so my question, and I don't know how to resolve this today, and that's why I apologize for bringing it up in the full board meeting, but I would like to move that we don't put this as a second and final reading, but add it to the consent calendar, because that is a question of vagueness of how do I know as a teacher every situation that's going to affect the mental health? And if this is in rule, could anyone come back and say, well, you didn't safeguard my student from this experience, and this is how it affected their mental health? I mean, a project that I may assign or an assessment, et cetera. And so I guess that's the question that I have is, how do we know what this means and what are some things that could come back? So, sorry.
Angie.
Thank you. Just quickly, this rule is one of those rules that it's actually going to sunset this month if we don't continue it. So there's a couple of options. We could either just make a motion today to continue it on second and final reading and not amend it, and then bring the amendments back on third on consent for next month. Or you could pass this version on second and final reading as amended and continued, and then we could actually bring back that specific issue as a different whole discussion next month, and then refile 515 again. So there's really those two options, but we would please ask that the board at least continue this rule this month so it doesn't sunset.
Board Member Lear.
I have another proposed amendment and would like more discussion. So I would like to take option number 1, behind door number 1, that says I'd like to continue it, and I'd be willing to make that motion now if that's in order.
Let me, the committee, we can still amend the original, we're still in a position that we can amend the motion, and the
Right, but I understand that.
the motion from committee, so you can amend it.
I know, I was just thinking, though, my amendment combined with Brittany's amendment may take a little more discussion, because I see the problem that Brittany raises now like I never have, which in fact perhaps contradicts another law that doesn't allow teachers to interfere with or talk about students' mental health. So I think that particular section there needs to be more discussion. There's also some conflicting language in the suicide prevention law, and I think that deserves more discussion and to find better words. And my other idea I would like to have more discussion about too, and I will propose the amendment if you want. I'd just rather continue the rule and have that discussion in the committee of those two issues.
Okay, let me just tell you where we're at. Brittany didn't make an amendment to any, well, she did earlier, but not to this, but she brought up a concern. And so what we have before us out of committee is that the board approve R277-515 as amended and continued on second and final reading, including these amendments. So that is what is before us today and at this present time.
And
Unless
can I make
we have an amendment.
or a substitute motion, is that in order?
No, I think we have to amend this or if we don't want to go this way, then we.
I just want to
Put it down.
continue the rule without these amendments and discuss them further. Is
What's
that
that? Well, we have this motion on the table here that came out of committee. So you can just have discussion on,
Then I'll propose my other amendment. Is that okay? Can I do that?
yeah, but before we do something, did someone have a light on here? Because Carol, you're getting a
He
lot of time
changed his
here.
mind.
Okay, no, okay, Laura, one more.
Oh, yes or
Board-
no?
Chair Hansen.
I think since we're in agreement on all of these amendments that we've already made, that we probably ought to just pass it as amended and continue it, this version, and then put it back on the agenda for committee for next month to look at additional amendments. So that would be my motion.
Well, we still have a motion on the
So,
table.
so I would
This is
move.
the amendment to that.
Yes. So I would move that we approve R277-515 as amended and continued on second and final reading, and then ask staff to bring it back to law and licensing for additional amendments next month.
Okay. We have an amendment to the motion. It was second by Board Member Stokes, Board Member Lear.
And I'm opposed to that motion primarily because I don't want to pass a rule, even for 1 month, that we know is in conflict with state law. And that is the problem with the mental health language that Brittany raises. And I don't think that's wise to, even for a month, have a rule in the name of efficiency that would pass. The state law is in 553A-13-302 that says that a teacher cannot 53A-13-302 that says a teacher, and there's another section under, I think it's 15, about
Angie,
diagnosing
can you
students.
speak to that potential conflict?
Yes, I just wanted to tell you that that language is in effect right now. So this motion to pass the amendments on second and final reading, the language shall take action to protect a student from any known condition detrimental to that student's physical health, mental health, safety, or learning is already
get
in
that.
515.
I get that. And,
Yeah.
and I feel like that I'm not going to vote to further, it's stuck there. But I can't vote for the rule to be continued and passed with that language in there, having brought it to my attention. I get that it's still there, and I admit it's a bit of a catch-22.
Okay. The motion is that the board approve R277-515 as amended today and continued on second and final reading, and have it brought back to law and licensing next month. Staff doesn't bring it back. We bring it back. Not seeing any further discussion, let's vote on the motion. All in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed? Motion passes unanimously. Oh, did it? Okay, we've got to hear the no's.
No.
Okay, thank you. We have one no. Okay, please continue.
Okay, and if you thought that was fun,
That was just that amendment. You have to vote.
board bylaws
Hold-
and
hold
board
on, hang on
policy.
one sec.
Oops.
No, I thought we voted on, we've already,
We voted to, Lynn,
Oh,
no,
we
no,
voted
no,
for
we're
mine.
going back to the original motion. She is
Yes,
absolutely right.
you're right. You're right,
Okay.
Lorraine, sorry.
motion's amended.
The motion is, okay, we're back to that last amendment was in. So the committee moves, okay, the motion is that the board approve R277-515 as amended and continued on second and final reading, and have it returned to law and licensing
For additional amendments.
for additional amendments.
Yeah.
Okay, that is the motion. Not seeing any discussion, let's vote. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed?
No.
Thank you, Carol. One no.
Okay,
Okay.
now we're ready to move on.
Yes.
Okay, this is the fun part you guys have been waiting for, okay? We looked at the election policies in Board Bylaws and Board Policy 2002. Because the Attorney General's office, well, we were going to look at it anyway, but the Attorney General's office has said that we need to change it because it needs to be a public vote. So we looked at all kinds of things, all kinds of possible changes, and came to no conclusion. So we don't have a recommendation to the board, but we do know that it needs to be changed. So I do think that Ben and Angie have come up with some possible scenarios for us to look at, if the board would like to do that.
Okay, we'd like to invite Ben and Angie. Now, this is, at this point, board members, this is when we are going to have discussion, and when we're done, we're going to end up, as we have a dialogue, I think we need to have a dialogue first, and then after we have this dialogue, then I'll seek a motion. So we're not starting off with a motion, or we'll be here a very long time. So with that, Angie, are you going to get the screen? Are we going to do a few things that will simplify this? Because we probably don't have everything that you have in front of you, and then if we tweak
Yes.
something, so.
We'll do that. I was just going to explain the memo that Ben prepared for your consideration today. There are 4 versions of Board Policy 2002 that have been prepared, but there's kind of 6 issues, kind of all amongst those 4 versions. And so in order to really narrow down which revision or version of Board Policy 2002 the board wants, we've got 6 policy questions that Ben has prepared in a memo, which I'm going to pull up in just a moment, that you can talk about each individual kind of component of the election changes, and then based on where you'd like to be on those 6 components, we can tell you which revision of Board Policy 2002 matches that or needs to be revised to match your desire. So I'll get the board memo up, and then what Ben is, and we were asked to do this by Linda and Board Member Hanson and other board members help facilitate this discussion. We'll go through each of the 6 policies. You can give us direction, and then we can tell you which board revision will be best. So I'll pull that up now, and you can go ahead and talk if you want.
Okay, so the first 2 policy questions are fairly related, and that is, when do you determine the number of vice chairs that will be appointed, and then when do candidates declare themselves? And so that's basically a question of, do you do this in advance of the election date, or do you do this at the time of the meeting where you do your elections? So those would be the first 2 policy questions, is when do you determine the number of vice chairs, and when should candidates declare their candidacy or be nominated? In the committee, I think there was some support for just doing that at the time of the election, but there wasn't any majority either way that passed in a motion. So I guess I just throw that out there to start out with.
So we're ready to, this is going to be a little bit like a committee meeting, but it's going to include the full board. So Board Member Belknap,
I came back to the table. On this question,
yes, the question was
when should we do,
determine the number of vice chairs and when candidates announce their.
okay, I'm going on question number 1,
Okay.
talking about question number 1. I found it really interesting last time we did this. It was almost like a frenzy. And I don't mean that rudely, okay? So please don't take that rudely, that maybe your candidate didn't get in, so let's do another one, let's do another one. So I really like the idea of doing 30 days prior when the election is not happening and we're not in the meat grinder at the time.
Anyone else want to speak to Board Member Bolter?
I just wanted to clarify, so you're saying that when it's not an election year for board members, that we would need to declare? Because in an election year, it would be a little bit harder for those being newly elected.
But the decision how many could be made 30 days in advance. How many?
But then in election years, I wouldn't want to make a decision for new ones coming in if I get voted off or if I don't run at all. They might want something different for their board.
Okay. Board Member
I
Bowman.
think that's already an establishment that happens, that the board continues on, and even if that determination is done, the new board that comes in, that's already the process, and then the next year they can change that. So, and the conundrum of 8 or 7 people isn't always the case. Could be 1 or 2 changes.
Right, I understand that.
Okay, Board Member Cannon.
Well, this is just floating around in my mind. Michelle brings up a good point, that there's something in statute that says new board members have full voting rights. So those who are elected, that would be every 2 years. And I'm wondering if their full voting rights would extend to determining the number of vice chairs. That's my question to the legal people.
Okay, so Angie?
In some ways, I could make an argument either way, because you could, in a board policy, just state right now that we have only 1 vice chair or 2 vice chairs, and that determination could be made before new board members are elected. But I think your argument is valid. I personally don't think it rises to the level of saying it would violate that statute, but it is something to consider, because you could argue that that determination of how many vice chairs is important enough that new board members should have the opportunity to vote on that. I think that's, yeah.
Any further comments on that? The challenge that we have before us is, last time I looked at this calendar, this year's gone by really quick. And next month, we'll be having our elections. And so, sorry, I didn't see your light on. Vice Chair Brittany Cummings, and then.
My thought is, this isn't a topic of huge importance. And so why not just put in the policy that, every other year we add the efficiency, and then on election years, we deal with the short turnaround on this particular decision. And so it's, I just don't see that it's that huge of a deal that we would have to worry about it too much.
Okay. Board Member Stokes?
So my bigger overarching policy question is, why do we go through this misery every year? Why don't we just make these 2-year positions? And is it in statutes in our board rule? Well, then here's one I would love to have a vote on. Let's go ask the legislature to change this portion of the statute. They do it every 2 years, and I don't think we're less good than them. It's very disruptive to have it happen every year, in my opinion. And there's no real good continuity if we're going to throw people out after a year. I mean, it just doesn't make any sense to me. So I guess my ask would be that we ask the legislature to change that to 2 years. That doesn't need to necessarily be unless we want to make it a motion. I would move that we ask the legislature to change this to every 2 years.
Can we have a second from Board Member Bolter?
Oh, I'll second that.
Well, we got a lot of seconds.
And now, today,
Okay.
Not like we can-
Any
are we
discussion
making-
to that motion? We have a motion,
Okay.
so, and we have a second. Any discussion to the motion? Board Member Lear?
I don't want to ask the legislature to do that. I don't want to ask the legislature to do anything other than fund schools. And that opens the statute up, and I think this is something the board should address internally. And personally, I think every year is fine because we have changes. I think the way I feel about leadership now is very different than the way I felt when I made a decision without knowing people. So I'm fine about changing every year. I don't think it's that disruptive. I think it's only 15 people. I don't want to open that statute up for other possible changes and surprises.
Okay. Board Member Hanson? Or, excuse me, not Hanson, Belknap, sorry. I thought-
I appreciate this discussion, Spencer. And just as a reminder, at any time we can change our board leadership. If we change it to the 2 years, we can do that. Anytime we can change board leadership.
Okay, any further discussion to the motion? The motion is to seek legislation to change the statute to accommodate a 2-year term. Is that what I'm? Seeing no discussion, let's vote. All in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed? No. Will the ayes raise their hand? Motion passes. Okay. Okay. All right, so moving back on to, yes, Angie.
I believe, Chair Hensman, that you raised an issue, a good one, which is if we do amend board policy 2002 to have the elections of the vice chairs 30 days in advance, that would have been in this board meeting. So 2 things you could consider would be, if you do want to amend the policy for this year, we could amend it to say in odd years only, which this is an odd year. That would avoid the conflict that Board Member Bolter brought up. And then you could add to an agenda item for tomorrow afternoon. If we did this quickly enough, you could actually have that tomorrow afternoon and vote on those 3 vice chairs tomorrow afternoon, and Lorraine's shaking her head, but you could notice something for tomorrow to have a special action item, as long as we do it 24 hours in advance, and you could take that vote tomorrow.
It is doable. Well, we'd have to change our agenda, but it is doable. So what exactly would be that
So it seems,
proposed amendment?
so what you could do, and maybe the best way to handle this discussion today is to actually vote on each policy question. So Here's the two that I would throw out based on the discussion here. The first, which would be an amendment to this 30 days prior, would be the board would determine the number of vice chairs to be elected in odd years, approximately 30 days prior to the election. That could be number one. And then number two would just be at the time of election, which is our current procedure. So those would be the two options.
Does anyone want to speak? Okay, Board Member Cannon.
Well, as I'm thinking, it seems to me if we leave it at the time of election, that it may be messy, but it works and it follows statute, and I would favor doing that. No, well, on policy, one question, she says 30 days prior or at the time of the election. I'm speaking in favor of at the time of the election.
Board Member Bolter.
I liked Angie's first option that we could set it 30 days prior, except for
Board meeting prior, actually.
board meeting prior. There we go. Except for even years. So I'll make that motion.
Can you make that motion?
Yes.
So, do we have,
Second.
what's that? Okay, Spencer seconded. Okay, Angie, will you restate that motion, please? I know you're taking the notes here, and this will kind of help clean some things up.
Yeah, so the motion would be that the board would determine the number of vice chairs to be elected for the coming year in the board meeting prior to the election in odd years, and then at the time of election in even years.
Okay, any discussion to that motion? Board Member Lear.
In the spirit of consistency and understandability by our stakeholders and ourselves, I would rather have it always at the time of the election and not overbake it.
Okay, any further discussion? Seeing none, let's vote. All in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed? No. Will the ayes raise their hand? 1, 2, 3, 4. You guys have your hands up over here. Who's it for? 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, motion failed. Any further discussion? Okay.
Okay.
To clarify then, that means that it'll be at the time of election. is
Correct.
Yeah, okay. Number two.
Okay,
Just
yes.
number two.
So the second policy question is if you're doing, if the decision's going to be made at the time of the election, I think the board members have to be nominated at the time of the election. So I think that's answers itself.
Yeah.
Any disagreement there? Question 3, it just deals with how candidates will campaign. There was some, you have a.
Okay. What, did you have a question? Hold on. Hang on, we've got some lights before we move forward. Did you have a question? Okay.
Well-
Vice Chair Ellis.
I know that I guess she's not in here at the chair, but Board Member Hanson, one of the things that she wanted to see was candidates to be able to put their name in early, and I don't see why they couldn't put it in if we didn't vote for how many positions a month before.
Well, you still don't have the unelected members present.
Right.
There wouldn't be a need
But-
to.
But they could if they wanted to.
They could float that, sure.
I guess Chair, you
Okay,
mind?
please.
Part of the issue might be if you don't know the number of vice chairs, it might change whether or not you would want to run or not. And so you can always declare your candidacy at least 7 days in advance, and maybe that's kind of the regular procedure. But the question is, do we want, because this question was specifically to say that the cutoff is if you don't declare your candidacy within 7 days, that you actually could not be nominated on the floor. Do you see so otherwise at the time of the election allows people to declare their candidacy, 15 days in advance, 7 days in advance. The question we had in committee was whether we wanted to write the board policy to require people to declare 7 days in advance, and then we would have no same-day nominations, day of the election. So because we don't know the number of chairs, vice chairs, we, I guess, assumed that you'd want to still allow people to nominate people or nominate themselves the day of the election. So that would be number 2 on 2
Okay.
at the time of the election.
I'm not seeing any discussion, so I think that's the course that will happen.
Okay, the third question, Chair, based on some of the language in the existing policy 2002 is which candidate should be allowed to essentially give their speech before the board right before vote. Question would be, should the chair and vice chair candidates all be allowed to give to address their colleagues and say why they should be elected prior to the election? I would assume all would be given the chance to speak.
Any discussion outside of that opposing the all? Board Member
Well,
Cannon?
it just seems in my mind that we would have candidates for board chair speak prior to their election and take care of that election, and then proceed to vice chairs, because I think maybe someone running for vice chair or for chair would want to run for vice chair if they weren't elected chair. And so I'm in favor of what does that. And I'm not quite clear by what you're saying there.
That's a separate question, but we could address the timing of the chair and vice chair. Voting shall be done separately if that could be done.
With the way that it's today. Yeah, so far we're not changing anything so far. Okay, there's more.
Okay, policy question 4 is how should the board conduct its election? So we've given the board a few options that can be used. The first one would be basically to maintain the status quo, however, taking into account the legal advice you've been given from the AG's office, would be to still conduct the secret ballot, but it's not so secret because you'd have to write your name on the ballot so that the board secretary could record the votes in the minutes to comply with the Open Meetings Act. That would still be multiple round voting, vote once, eliminate 1 or 2, vote again until you have a quorum. So that would be the first option, is to maintain the status quo. The second option, which was discussed in committee, is what's called preferential voting. And is everybody familiar with how preferential voting works? Would you like? Okay, so I'll explain it. With preferential voting, let's say there's 4 candidates. Each person would rank the candidates in the order of their preference of whether they win. So you would rank them 1, 2, 3, 4, and you would turn in your ballot with your name on it to the board secretary, the vice chair that's conducting the election. They would go through it after the first round. They would eliminate the candidate that got the least number of votes. They would take the ballots for that candidate and the least number of number 1 ranked votes. Thank you for that clarification. So they would take the first place votes for the 4th place candidate essentially, and the next round they would go with that person's 2nd place votes. So that and then it would go on, and you would eliminate 1 person per round until you have 1 person who's obtained a quorum. So that's basically how ranked voting works, and I can answer questions if that didn't make sense to someone. The third suggestion that was made at the committee was simply just to have an open voice vote, raise your hand, in board meeting for the candidate you want to advance, and that could be done in rounds if there was more than 2 candidates. So those were the three options we came up with for the board's consideration.
So I have a question on the preferential voting. The way you explained it, it would be whoever had the least amount of ranked
First place
1 would
votes.
be eliminated. So if everybody did all their ranking and say they everyone voted Janet Cannon number 2 was her number 2. So everybody on the board liked Janet and wanted her at number 2 rate, she would be eliminated under that particular process.
No.
Because she didn't receive any number 1 rankings.
Well, if she got no number 1 rankings, yes, she would.
That's what I mean. So
she
she
would
was
be
number 2
0 and
for
she would be
everybody on the board. She had 15 votes at number 2, and she would be eliminated because she didn't receive any number 1 votes.
Right.
Correct. You have to get We would count the number one votes, the highest rank for that candidate in that given round.
My hand whipped before hers.
Oh, did you?
We share a light.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay, but,
Well, we share a light.
okay, Board Member Stokes,
So, before I start down this road,
That's why I said.
might I say, I really think we could benefit by spending some money on a voting system here and on a microphone system here. I think it would help our meetings move smoother so that Lorraine isn't having to, we can just hit a button and it says green and she knows who voted yes. And if of all the money that we're saving that Scott has added up, I think we could afford to do that. Okay. So let me say, I would just want to ask a question about the Attorney General's overall premise in the open meetings law. So are you telling me that we cannot release the vote totals after we have to absolutely say who every person voted for? Because I have, that's the beginning of this policy discussion. And I think until we arrive at what that policy discussion is, working on these other three, and I'm happy to, we did preferential voting at the state convention for a number of years, so I can explain to you all about preferential voting. But I'd like to drill down on the heart of this question first.
okay, we have a question the question is,
What does it say? What does the open meetings law
yeah,
say?
is it what's open and,
I would be happy to read it if you'd like.
okay,
Perfect.
please do.
This is section 52-4-203, subsection 2, subsection 4. It says that written minutes of an open meeting shall include a record by individual member of each vote taken by the public body.
Okay. And I agree where we're taking action about about public policy.
Doesn't say that.
But this is a governance of our own internal board, not a public policy vote. And I get that it doesn't call that out, but every other body that I'm aware of in this state that elects their own leadership does not. I mean, the legislature, for example, doesn't do that.
They're exempt from this.
I understand they're exempt.
That's why.
Yes. Okay, one second,
again-
Angie or Dave Thomas, do you have something, comment? Then I'm going to go to your dad.
So the legislature has an exception to the Open and Public Meetings Act because they have a caucus system and their caucus meetings can be closed. And so when they vote for their leadership, they do that as Republicans or Democrats. And so that their leadership elections, you're absolutely correct, are not required to be done in a public way. I'd be interested to hear what other public body is doing them not publicly, but
And then let me jump back in again, reading the exact language of the open meeting statute. It talks about,
Would you give us the
Any- well,
statute again? I'm sorry.
yeah, not a problem, 52-4-203, paren 2, close paren, paren A, close paren, paren IV, close paren. And again, what it does is it says that this is the minutes of the open meeting shall include a record of every vote taken by the public body. So to the extent that it
public.
is a vote by the public body, then it has to be recorded pursuant to the Open and Public Meetings Act.
So do we in our
Board Member
minutes?
Stokes, is this a follow-up?
Yes.
Okay, and then we're going to move on, so,
Yeah.
okay.
Well, it doesn't matter. Let's just go to these discussions.
Okay.
This is something I believe that the legislature should address on governance, because we're not saying, I understand the transparency in public policy where you're changing a rule or you're voting on a contract but I don't see this as the same thing picking who your leadership is going to be. I think that's internal to the body, and it would be another thing I would ask that the legislature take a look at, because I do think there is a big difference, and I think somewhat of an unintended consequence of this. But I don't want to waste any time on this.
Okay, Vice Chair Ellis?
Okay, so I have two things. I'd like to add, it's not up there anymore, but a fourth option When we left our last board meeting and went to the USDB building, Jared Felt said he could create for us. So he's someone in our IT department, sorry, I'm bad with titles, but that he could create an online thing that could be open but also streamlined. And I also would really like to hear Spencer's version of preferential voting, because how you explain it is different than my understanding. And I don't feel as comfortable with the way you explain preferential voting. And I want to make sure that when we vote on something, because I personally favor preferential voting, if it's done right, and the way that it's being explained, I wouldn't favor. And so I would like to hear Spencer's version, and then we make sure that when we vote on that, we know exactly how it's going to proceed, because anyways, I think that needs to be clarified.
Okay, there's a request. Spencer, are you wanting to
Yes, I'd be happy to
respond to this?
talk about
I know
that.
there's other, okay.
So you would not do everything all at once. So there's this, I think some people think you're voting on all of them all at once, and that's not how we did it. But what would happen is you would rank in order of chair, probably start with chair, of the candidates that had filed. You'd list them in order, and you would put number 1 choice, number 2 choice, number 3 choice, number 4 choice, right? So that you would start with all of the number 1 or number 4 choices, or number 1 choices would be added up. And based on number 1 choices, that would go to the next round of voting. So if a person didn't get enough number 1 choices to make it to the second round of voting, they would be automatically thrown out. Okay? So then you go to, and if somebody got, 8 votes on the number 1 round, then it's over. But the person then becomes eliminated, and then you have to take each ballot and you go down to, okay, who was this? Here's this stack of ballots. These stacked, their number 1's still in. Over here, who's the number 2 of all of these other people whose ballots were their number 1 choice lost? That's how it works.
Do you have a
So then you do
follow-up?
vice chair.
Well,
then
and can
do
you
vice
put a
chair.
provision, I don't think anyone should be elected without a majority, and so could you put a
That's all
provision that
part
they
of
get a
it.
majority?
That's in there. Okay, Board Member Lear, and then,
No, well, let me think.
okay,
But
while you're thinking, Board Member Hanson?
I was just wondering, Mark, you can probably answer this one for me, how the school board that you were on did it, because the school board, and I won't name them, that I've seen do it, elections, would go into executive session, and they would talk about, I assume they would talk about the candidates, personal attributes and all of those things, and then they would come out and vote. And most of the time, they came out and voted unanimously for whoever. So I just wonder how it was done, because you were on a local school board.
Okay, can I, before we get in, Angie, but to answer that, could we have Terry Shoemaker come up, because he's seen multiple, and I know they do it different, but they're not all consistent, but it does happen in an open, everyone I've been involved, open meeting. Terry.
Terry Shoemaker, I represent the School Board Association, the Superintendent's Association. I haven't seen it done that way. Actually, the way I've seen it done, and my Board of Education, I always indicated them there to discuss amongst each other, and then the vote was to take place in the open meeting, just like what you're doing. You're taking place in the open meeting. And they would discuss amongst each other offline, call each other and have conversations with each other and talk about who was interested in this and that and the other. And then they would go ahead, and a motion was taken in the open meeting for the president and voted on. And sometimes there were more than one, sometimes. And that occurred. And if they didn't get a majority, just like what's happened with you, they would take another motion. So that has happened. And I'm sure it happens in other school boards too. Secondly, they would do that for vice president also, but again, they would do that every 2 years rather than every year, simply because that's the way they handled it. So,
Yeah,
iPad, it's done in open meeting, everyone sees who's
Yeah, the vote is, yeah.
it's all very
I
open.
have a clarification for that.
I'd just like to state that you could go into executive session because this is discussion of the competence and character
Character
of
and competence.
individuals. You could talk about the individuals who are running and kind of the way you, almost the way you do with your UPAC. You take official votes on UPAC decisions in an open meeting, but when you're talking about the people who are having licensing actions against them, you do that in a closed section to not have that open discussion. So the one thing that Dave Thomas and I were kind of talking about here on the side, local school boards are much smaller, number one, than this board. This is a 15-member board. The local boards are 5 or 7 members. And so those discussions that happen informally, happen. But it would be, you are authorized in the Open and Public Meetings Act to go into executive session to have these discussions, and that might be the better way to do this so that you're not circumventing the Open and Public Meetings Act by having informal discussions outside. And so it would just be the opportunity, go in executive session, talk about it. You could hopefully get a sense at that point who everybody is, and then you make your motion once you come back into the public meeting and hope that you get a unanimous or an 8-member vote. That's one thing you could do that would be very similar to what local school boards do, but they might do it a little more informally because they're smaller number.
Board Member Bolter.
I just wanted to clarify because, and correct me if I'm wrong, AAG Thompson, but my understanding was that in order to satisfy the open meeting laws, we could still have a secret ballot vote, but our name would have to be on it. So then when it was reported in the meeting minutes, it would show how each member voted. And I'm extremely comfortable with that. I am not at all comfortable with raising hands, even if we decide in a closed session, which I'm not even comfortable with that either. I'd like to keep everything open because we're running for office, and the public should also have a chance to hear what our chair, the vision for the board is, and the vice chairs. And then secret ballot, and then have that out.
Okay. Vice Chair Ellis, who's been waiting patiently. Hopefully you got
I
your
was
thought.
just going to make a motion to use the preferential voting system as described. Well, I think they really are the same, just that it's each position is its own vote. Because I know there were some people that wanted to possibly, if there was 2 or 3 vice chairs, that it's all just one round, but I think it should be each position separate. And I prefer the paper, and with the paper balloting.
Okay, there's a motion to use the preferential voting with paper. But that's what's intended anyway. It's already been laid out that per position. And we have a second from Spencer. Discussion. Board Member Lear, and then.
I don't favor anything that doesn't have us voting publicly. I think that's a circumvention of the spirit of the Open Meetings Act. Putting our names on a ballot that's later displayed or exposed in the minutes is not the same as a public vote, I don't believe. Yes, it's more comfortable. Yes, it's more convenient. But I don't think it's public voting, and I think that that's the purpose of a public meeting. And though the twisted, if you read the language a certain way in the statute, perhaps that's okay. I don't believe that is the spirit of the Public and Open Meetings Act.
Board Member Cannon.
Yeah, my question is to the motion. So if we have we're kind of combining number 1 and number 2 because we're saying preferential voting and then on paper. And then, so how is that reported out?
By round.
So these people voted for so-and-so first place, these people voted for so-and-so second place.
It would be per round if that's the case, every round of voting, so that the public would see how elevate, which, that for clarity,
That,
that's what,
that
that's how it
seems a
would be
little
posted.
messy to me.
Okay.
I
But
guess
that's-
I favor the status quo over that. And I favor the status quo because years ago, I started dealing with state board elections and went and interviewed every state board member, and it was a different board at that time, but that was what most of them favored.
Status quo has to change though, because we've not been complying with the law.
We haven't been releasing how we voted at the end.
So we can't keep status quo.
Okay, let's keep it, if somebody needs to add, let's turn your light on and be recognized. Was there a light over? Okay, Board Member Bolter.
From our understanding is we can't keep the status quo because we were not complying with the law, because we weren't releasing how each board member voted at the end. So either way, whether it's, because the status quo is still for 8 votes, and it would have to be every single round. So it would be the same as preferential. As far as Board Member Lear raising our hands and voting, it's just, I'm just not very comfortable with that. And if other people are, that's fine, but I don't want to be given odd looks for voting a certain way or bullied into changing my vote, which I can see something like that happening. Or Elisa telling me to vote the right way.
Okay, Ben.
If I can just explain to Member Cannon, Chair, so where we've put status quo, we put status quo with the intention that you'd still vote the same, but you have to write your name on the ballot so that the votes could be recorded. That would be okay. That is an option. But you'd have to just record your name.
But, yes.
And just one other thing I wanted to clarify, that yes, Board Member Ellis's motion kind of combines question 4 and question 6, because if you do preferential voting, you have to do it in a written way, because there's no way to voice vote saying I want 1, 2, 3, and 4. You probably could do it technically, but it kind of makes the most sense if you do preferential voting to do it. So her motion combined policy question 4 and 6 together.
Okay, Board Member Hanson, then.
I call the question.
Okay, we had a motion second. We're called the question, cease debate here. All in favor to end debate, say aye. Those opposed? Okay, now we're going to the motion. The motion is to go with the preferential voting as outlined here. All in favor, say aye. Those opposed? No. We have 2. Okay. What's next?
So that leaves us with one final policy option, because by that decision, that basically decides question 6. But with question 5, and Board Member Hanson raised this question with me, with the preferential voting would be what to do if in last place you have a tie for last place. With the size of this board, I think that's probably a very realistic possibility that you'd have a tie in last place. And so it would just be a question of, do you eliminate all the candidates that are in last place? Do you eliminate the candidate that received the fewest votes in the previous round, if that's applicable? I've seen some descriptions of this where they'll flip a coin or do something random, but it would just be a policy question of how you want to handle that logistically if you have a tie for last place. So,
if I might throw something in, and I haven't been a part of the conversation very much, but what I've seen in the past is it comes back and say, hey, there's a tie. And then it comes back and votes. So there's not this game of chance to.
no, and you could certainly do a revote. That would be
It
another.
ends up being a revote.
That could be an
And
option
that's
too.
Just for that place. Right.
Yeah.
I'll do a revote to see who advances.
Out of the 2.
Okay.
So when you're saying a tie for last place,
So let's say there's
right?
3
For the
For
candidates.
the elimination, you got to come up with the eliminate.
Right,
3 candidates. One candidate gets 7, the other 2 get 4.
correct. Then you'd come back and vote just those 2.
To see who advances to the next
Yes.
round. And then you take the original ballots.
Then you
from
go
there.
back to the original ballots.
Is that,
That's
how you want to
very
do it?
fair. Okay, any other loose ends?
So I think what we need to do at this point is to edit the board policy and board bylaws and bring them back to you maybe later in the afternoon to reflect this. Would that work?
Or do you want us?
Well, we're,
Well, this is going to necessitate a lot of changes to what we drafted.
well, we need to, we've already been taking action here, but
What you could do, Chair, if I might.
yes.
We could revise the board policy 2002 based on this input. Send it to all board members. I mean, you take the vote now and essentially the action is done. We could send out the revised board policy as we understand it. And if nobody finds a mistake or a problem with what we send out, then you can ask later in today for us to bring this back for reconsideration, this item. Does that make sense, what I'm asking? Right, but you don't think we can get that done? Oh, yeah.
Board,
Yeah.
one second, Board Member Lair.
Before we conclude and take this vote, I just have to say I favor public voting. I feel like this is not a sixth grade class election. I personally can't be bullied into voting for someone or the other, and I feel like we should be elected officials and vote openly so the public can see there is no more important policy issue than who our leadership is. Thank you.
Okay, so Angie, so you're going to clean this up and bring back to us, and then later on our agenda, we'll bring it back
Is that
towards the
okay?
end. We'll find a spot because
Perfect.
we're really efficient today.
Perfect.
Okay.
Thank you.
I think this is the longest board report I've ever had.
You're setting records.
All righty. R277519, Educator Professional Learning Procedures and Credit. Diana brought this to us. There was actually, the way they were doing it was different than what the rule said. And so we looked at it and we recommend, and we updated the rule to give authority to the superintendent instead of the LEAs, which isn't happening now anyway. So we move to approve R277519 as amended on first reading, and that passed unanimously. And we move that the board approve, Law and Licensing moves that the board approve R277519 as amended on second and final reading.
Motion for the board is to approve R277-519 as amended on second and final reading. Any discussion? Seeing none, let's vote. All in, okay. Board Member Lisa Cummins.
What, I have a question. What professional learning credit are we discussing? Where is that coming from? What is the resources being used there?
Do you want to,
Diana would, she just.
just
walked in.
Diana's,
Yeah, she's.
So Diana Sudworth, Director of Teaching and Learning. I apologize. I was hugging somebody in the audience, so I need you to repeat the question.
So the question is, what resources are being used for the learning credit? What are we looking at? What is that? What is the resource?
So I'm not sure if you're asking about the resources that are used for the professional learning. We authorize credit based on the professional learning standards, which the board has approved. So when an LEA or an organization or one of our specialists wants to have credit associated with the professional learning, we ask them to match that up with the professional learning standards. And if there is a match, if there's an alignment there, and if there are sufficient number of hours, which is 14 hours of seat time plus 2 hours of homework kinds of activities, then that is approved for USBE credit.
Okay, I do, but I might have to do it offline with Diana. Thank you.
oh, sorry. The motion is that the board approve R277-519 as amended on second and final reading. Seeing no further discussion, let's vote. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? No. We have one no.
I think I better be a no too.
Okay, we have a second.
I'm a little slow, but
Okay. Motion passes.
Okay, Early College Coursework Committee, this is really an exciting committee. They are working on fixing the underrepresentation of students from diverse backgrounds in early college coursework programs like AP, Concurrent, and NIV. They're trying to get them so that there are more of those students involved. And so they gave us an update and a report, and that was it. Then we adjourned our meeting.
Okay, that concludes your report.
Yes, that's
Thank you very much.